Yeah, so I just want to address that for a second, Rain. I think this is an area where a lot of people don't understand what had happened across the Air Force. I'm going to use 2012 as a line in the sand because that is when I came back from the Pentagon, back into the squadron at the operational level, right? And when I got back to Shaw Air Force Base in 2012, I was the director of operations, so the number two in charge of the squadron, and I took over the Gamblers in June of 2013. During that time at Shaw, when I came to Shaw, I was there 2000, 2003 as just a line captain, right? Just flying the F-16. That was my job. I wasn't an instructor yet. I was a flight lead. And at that time in the squadron, we had the squadron commander who was like, almost 3,000 hours as instructor pilot. The DO was 2,500 hours as instructor pilot. All of our flight commanders were either majors or in the only case where it wasn't major, it was a captain who was getting ready to go to weapons school. So, highly talented, tons of experience, 1,250 hours in the airplane, the F-16. And then underneath that were captains who were already instructor pilots. We probably had 12 instructor pilots just internal to the squadron. Caveat or compare that to 2012 when I show up at the 79th. The squadron commander was an IP. I just came off the staff, so I didn't get qualified as an IP yet. We had the weapons officer and we had one flight commander, 4 total instructors, and I wasn't even qualified yet. So the amount of experience, the level of experience had completely inverted. And I tell you that to give you some context. So one of the very first things we did when I was a squadron commander, I took over in June. And I want to say that Pyro and Chaos were the first two. One was a flight lead, one was a wingman that came from Korea. But the first 2 people I was able to draft, we do this internal selection of who we need to balance out the experience in the squadron. And at that time, we looked at the deployment, and I sat down with my DO at the time, my director of ops, and we said, those guys have to be instructors by the time we leave because the only other instructor we have was getting ready to go to weapons school, which was great for him. I was really excited for him. But we just looked at the squadron experience level, and I tell you that to tell you that was a lot of work that Pyro and Chaos had to do, an unbelievable amount of work. And then on top of that, they also happen to be some of our most experienced captains, just because, again, the experience had inverted. So I've trained them both up to be flight commanders, and they both are taking us to red flags as, an event POC, which is a ton of planning and a ton of coordination. Pyro at that time had also taken us to a green flag, right? And he was also my mobility coordination officer for when we were deployed. And I tried. This was weekly. I would talk to my DO about, we've got to get stuff off of his plate. We've got to get stuff off his plate. But we just didn't have the people. We were building up the number of people in the squadron, which was great, but they were all in training. They all showed up either needing mission qualification training top off, or they were young. You were the exception, right? You did need a mission qualification top off, but you were a captain that had experience based off things that happened. So as soon as you got mission qualified, I can't remember if it was 10 minutes or 10 hours, but I guarantee you it was in that same week. I gave you an additional job in the squadron because we just didn't have any other people. And truthfully, I can't remember what I asked you to do, but I guarantee you I asked you to do something that probably took time off your plate.
It was really important, I know. But I do remember that time because I showed up. It was busy as a new guy trying to figure out the politics of the squadron, like who's who, and just getting the vibe because that's my first fighter squadron. Granted, I'd been a FAPE, so I'd been around the squadron life and had some experience. So you kind of saw at least how the squadron worked, and you kind of get a feel for stuff. But again, I show up, I got to figure that out. I got to figure out what my requirements are. But I remember Chaos and Pyro specifically, because they were both younger than me. Obviously, they've been in the Viper longer than that. But I was watching them balance their new roles of flight commander while they were both going in the IPUG, knowing how busy they were. And I remember Pyro being the Wessup pro jokes. The funny story there is I do remember him, like, he was running full speed ahead. And, like, that's not even, like, he had an afterburner and it was stuck there. And I remember he overslept one morning. And he was the pro Joe, and he showed up late. It happens. And he got in a little bit of trouble for that, but it's just kind of a funny story about Pyro that just like makes me chuckle to this day. But I mean, Chaos and Pyro, those guys were humping it. I mean, everyone was humping it, just trying to get the minimum done, right? And then trying to be, then add a little bit more on there, but we had to check all the boxes to get things done. And it was busy. It was a busy time.
Yeah. So were you a mobility officer? Is that where we put you before
I
the
was the
squadron left?
CELO, so the Standard Evaluation Liaison Officer, whatever,
Yeah.
paperwork, check rides and stuff like that. I became the mobility guy after Tally, because I think Pyro was mobility, and then Tally took over right when he finished the IPUG, which, I mean, that job was insane.
So I want to put that in perspective for our listeners, because you're doing a nice job of being humble, and I appreciate that. But you being a CELO at that time, so remember when I was at Shaw the first time, our CELO was a major who had 1,100 hours and was an evaluator pilot. So had gone all the way through the instructor program and now was an authorized evaluator pilot for the squadron. You had just gotten qualified in the F-16. And I made you a CELO because you had the officer timeline. Like you said, you'd already been a FAPE. You'd been a captain longer. I think you were the oldest captain in the squadron or second oldest captain in the squadron. And so I was trying to balance your maturity and leadership with your inexperience in the airplane. So, me putting you in that position, it just goes to show how much I trusted you, but also like I would have loved to not have had to put you there so you could just focus on flying the F-16, but that just wasn't the way it worked out.
The time period you're referencing, you said 2003 to 2004. That's, really when it was, you had the guys, I would say the right guys in the right spot, and you weren't having to make concessions to fill boxes or fill squares there. What was the inversion? That's probably a whole separate podcast in itself, but snapshot, why did we end up that way in 2012 on? Why so inexperienced?
I'm going to give you the 30,000 foot picture as I saw it happening.
Yeah.
F-35 was starting to come on board. So F-22 getting done with OT in like 2005, 2006, starting to become a mature weapon system. F-35 was already, I don't know that we'd started making them yet. I think we started producing them in 2008. But in the F-16, F-35 transition, somewhere in that time frame, and I'm not going to be able to tell you the specific year. It was not sequestration, because I know that was in 2012. But we had a similar event where we went through this big, the Air Force in particular had to make concessions. F-22 was a very expensive airframe. We were trying to bring drones on board. We were looking for ways to trim the budget, and that was just something that was happening DoD-wide across the Pentagon. And what we decided to do as a force, obviously not me, but what generals at the Pentagon decided to do, was to eliminate a large portion of F-16 training with the assumption that F-35 was going to ramp up commensurate with F-16 ramp down. And when F-35 got delayed, go figure, you're making one airplane for 3 different units and they all do different things. The consequence of those ramps not happening at the same time, we had really not thought about what would happen, because the F-16 at that time was training 3 times as many fighter pilots as any other airframe, because there's 3 times as many F-16s. Like, it's not magic. Right. We weren't doing anything better. It was just and so when that throughput slowed down, we couldn't take as many pilots out of pilot training and put them into fighter cockpits. So we slowed down pilot training, and that caused a tidal wave that then started in about 2009 to 2010. There was not enough pilots to transition to the Guard and Reserve. They were hiring like crazy. So that put even additional pressure. And then, oh, by the way, airlines were hiring like crazy at that time. So those 3 things, the training reduction, because that takes years to stand back up, followed by 2 additional external factors, Guard and Reserve hiring and airlines hiring. We saw retention rates go somewhere from between 65 to 70% of people were signing the bonus to about 25 to 30%. And that happened for like 4 straight years. And you're seeing the results of that now. Or you saw it. We saw it then. It is also, there's been other things since then that have happened. Retention rates have come back a little bit, but not tremendously so. Not where it needs to be.
Moral story, this doesn't happen overnight. And it leads us to where we are today. I mean, there's several things, and they're still dealing with, even though it's come back a little bit, retention's still a factor. And I think you would still find inexperience relatively low, especially if you compare it to the early 2000s.